The stars had always called to humanity. For 300 years, they answered that call with open hands and peaceful hearts. They traveled across the galaxy not as conquerors, but as friends. They built trade routes instead of battle lines. They shared medicine instead of weapons. They believed that kindness was the greatest strength any species could show. The galaxy had other ideas about strength. 47 species made up the Galactic Concord, a loose alliance that kept peace through treaties and trade. Humanity joined them 2 centuries ago and quickly became known for one thing above all else. They were soft. They smiled when insulted. They negotiated when threatened. They always chose to talk instead of fight. The older species found this amusing. The younger ones found it pathetic. But everyone agreed on one simple truth. Humans were no threat to anyone. The Velthari Dominion watched humanity with hungry eyes. The Velthari were insectoid creatures, tall and armored with natural shells harder than steel. They had conquered 17 species in their long history. Their entire civilization was built on one belief: the strong rule and the weak serve. They looked at humanity's peaceful ways and saw only one thing: prey. New Eden was humanity's largest colony outside the Sol system. It orbited a yellow star much like Earth's sun, and its green fields stretched across 3 continents. 4.2 million people called it home. Farmers who grew food for a dozen worlds, scientists who studied the local plants and animals, teachers who filled schools with laughing children, families who had built lives far from Earth but carried its spirit in their hearts. The colony had no warships, no planetary defense cannons, nothing but a small security force meant to handle criminals, not armies. New Eden was protected by something humans believed was stronger than weapons. The treaties of the Galactic Concord promised that no member species would attack an undefended civilian world that the Velthari had signed those treaties. They simply did not care. Admiral Vrexus stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Hunger, and looked down at New Eden with cold, compound eyes. Behind him waited a fleet of 30 warships, each one bristling with weapons that could crack continents. His orders came directly from the Velthari High Command. Make an example. Show the galaxy what happens to weak species who forget their place. He gave the order without hesitation. The first warning the colonists received was fire. Falling from the sky, orbital bombardment struck the 3 largest cities simultaneously. Millions of tons of superheated plasma rained down on homes and schools and hospitals. Buildings that had stood for generations vanished in seconds. The screams of the dying mixed with the roar of destruction until both were swallowed by silence. But the Velthari were not finished. Ground forces descended on the burning ruins. They moved through the streets with terrible efficiency, hunting down survivors. The old and the young received no mercy. The sick and the healthy died the same way. Families who tried to flee were cut down in the fields they had once farmed with such pride. The Velthari recorded everything. Every death was broadcast across galactic communication channels. Every scream was transmitted for all species to hear. Admiral Vrexus appeared on screens across 1,000 worlds, standing amid the ashes of what had once been New Eden's capital city. "Let this be a lesson," he announced, his mandibles clicking with satisfaction. Humanity forgot that they are small. They forgot that they are weak. We have reminded them. Any species that trades with humans, that allies with humans, that shows them kindness of any sort, will share their fate. He crushed a child's toy beneath his armored foot. Humanity is prey. Nothing more. The broadcast ended. The galaxy watched in silence. Some species felt pity for the humans. They were kind creatures after all. Harmless, they did not deserve such cruelty. But pity did not translate to action. No one would risk Velthari anger for the sake of a species that could not even defend itself. Other species felt nothing at all. This was simply the natural order. The strong consumed the weak. Humanity should have known better than to venture into a galaxy that did not share their gentle dreams. The Galactic Concord issued a formal statement expressing concern. They promised an investigation. They assured humanity that proper diplomatic channels would address this. It's an unfortunate incident. Humanity did not respond. On Earth, 300 light-years from New Eden's ashes, billions of humans watched the broadcasts. They watched their people die. They watched their children burn. They watched alien monsters parade through streets that human hands had built, crushing human dreams beneath alien feet. Something changed in that moment. For 3 centuries, humanity had kept a promise to themselves. They had sworn to leave behind the violence that nearly destroyed their own world. They had buried their warships and melted their weapons and taught their children that peace was the only path worth walking. They had looked at their bloody history and felt shame. And they had vowed to be better. They had chosen to be civilized. Now, watching New Eden burn, they remembered something they had tried so hard to forget. Before they were traitors, they were survivors. Before they were diplomats, they were fighters. Before they reached for the stars with open hands, they had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of war against each other. Humanity had nearly destroyed itself not because they were weak. They had nearly destroyed themselves because they were too good at violence, too creative, too adaptable, too utterly relentless. When pushed too far, they had chosen peace because they knew what they were capable of when they chose war. The Velthari did not know this. The galaxy did not know this. They had only ever seen humanity smile and bow and negotiate. They were about to learn the truth. In every nation on Earth, in every colony across the solar system, emergency sessions were called. Leaders who had spent their lives preaching peace looked at each other with ancient fire in their eyes. Generals whose roles had been purely ceremonial pulled old files from secure vaults. Scientists who had devoted themselves to medicine and agriculture suddenly remembered other formulas. Darker formulas, equations that could crack worlds and shatter suns. The United Earth Assembly gathered in Geneva, and Chancellor Amara Okonkwo stood before them. She was a tall woman with gray hair and kind eyes that had seen too much. She had spent 40 years building bridges between species, believing with all her heart that understanding could triumph over hatred. Now, she looked at the faces of her people and saw the same thing in every eye. Not fear, not grief, something older. Something that human DNA had, carried since the first ancestor picked up a sharp rock and decided to fight back against a predator. She knew what they needed permission. 300 years ago, she began, her voice steady despite the fire in her chest. We made a choice. We looked at what we had done to each other, the rivers of blood we had spilled across our own world, and we swore never again. We chose to be gentle. We chose to be kind. We chose to believe that civilization meant something. She paused, and the silence was absolute. New Eden is ash. Our children are dead. And the galaxy laughs at our grief because they think our kindness means we are weak. Her eyes hardened into something that had not been seen on a human leader's face in 300 years. We will correct that assumption. We stopped being civilized. Across the galaxy. The Velthari celebrated their easy victory. They had no idea what was coming. The galaxy waited for humanity to cry. They waited for desperate diplomats to flood the SEO's assembly halls, begging for justice that would never come. They waited for tearful broadcasts pleading for mercy from a universe that had none to give. They waited for humans to do what humans always did. Talk, negotiate, surrender with dignity, and accept their place at the bottom of the galactic order instead. Humanity went quiet. 3 days after the massacre, every human embassy across the galaxy closed its doors. Diplomats who had spent decades building relationships with alien species simply packed their belongings and boarded ships heading home. They offered no explanations. They answered no questions. They just left. Human trade vessels stopped appearing at alien ports. Contracts worth billions of credits went unfulfilled. Medical supplies that human scientists had developed, medicines that only Earth could produce, suddenly became unavailable. Species that had grown, dependent on human goods, found their requests met with silence. The communication channels that humanity maintained went dark. Messages sent to Earth bounced back unanswered. The great network of human information hubs that connected dozens of worlds simply switched off, one by one, until nothing remained but static. By the 10th day, not a single human ship flew outside the Sol system. The Velthari High Command found this hilarious. "They are hiding," Admiral Vrexus reported to his superiors, his mandibles clicking with amusement. "Like prey animals, retreating to their burrow. They know we could follow them. They know we could burn their homeworld just as easily as we burned their colony. They are waiting for us to grow bored, hoping we will forget about them." The High Command agreed. Humanity was broken. Soon they would send groveling messengers offering tribute, promising eternal submission in exchange for survival. It was always the same with weak species. A demonstration of power, a period of terror, and then complete surrender. They began composing their terms for Earth's capitulation. Meanwhile, other species grew curious. The Neth, a race of aquatic traders who had dealt extensively with humanity, sent a small observation vessel to the edge of the Sol system. They wanted to see what was happening behind that wall of silence. What they found made no sense to them. Earth's orbital defense platforms, that modest structures that everyone assumed were purely ceremonial, had tripled in size. New stations were appearing in the void. Massive constructions of metal and fire that dwarfed anything the Neth had seen outside of Velthari military installations. The asteroid belt that lazily drifted between Mars and Jupiter now blazed with industrial light. Forged ships the size of cities were pulling raw materials from rocks and transforming them into something the Neth could not quite identify. The moons of Jupiter and Saturn, once quiet research outposts, now hummed with activity. Ships emerged from beneath their surfaces, not the sleek trading vessels the galaxy knew, but something different. Something older. Something covered in weapon ports and armored plating that seemed to drink in starlight. The Neth observers recorded everything they could before. A human patrol vessel appeared beside them without warning. No weapons were fired. No threats were issued. A single human officer appeared on their communication screen, his face calm and empty of the friendly warmth aliens had come to expect. "Leave now," he said. "Do not return. Do not tell anyone what you saw." The Neth left. They told everyone. Rumors spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Humanity was building something. Some species believed it was a desperate defensive measure, a final attempt to protect their homeworld from Velthari vengeance. Others whispered darker theories. Perhaps the humans were not as harmless as they had appeared. Perhaps those 3 centuries of peace had been a choice, not a necessity. The Galactic Concord grew nervous. They sent an official delegation to the Sol system's border, demanding that humanity explain its military buildup. Treaty obligations required all major military expansions to be reported and approved. Humanity had signed those treaties. Humanity had always followed the rules. The delegation waited at the border for 6 days. On the 7th day, a single human vessel emerged from the void to meet them. It was a diplomatic ship, the kind humanity had always used for peaceful negotiations. But the message it carried was anything but peaceful. Chancellor Amara Okonkwo appeared on the delegation's screens, standing in what looked like a war room filled with military officers and strategic displays. Her kind eyes had become cold stone. Her gentle voice had become quiet steel. "You want explanations?" she said. "Very well. 30 days ago, a member species of your Concord murdered 4.2 million of our citizens. Children were burned alive in their schools. Families were hunted through the streets they built with their own hands. And your Concord did nothing. Your treaties meant nothing. Your laws protected no one." She held up a small object. A child's doll, burned and broken, recovered from the ashes of New Eden. "You sent us a message expressing concern. How kind, how civilized." She set the doll down carefully as if it were made of glass. "Here's our response. Your treaties are void. Your laws do not apply to us. And any species that interferes with what comes next will be treated as an enemy of humanity." The delegation's leader, a senior Concord diplomat who had negotiated peace between warring species for 40 years, tried to reason with her. He spoke of proportional response in diplomatic channels and the importance of maintaining galactic stability. Chancellor Okonkwo cut him off. For 300 years, we showed the galaxy our humanity, our mercy, our restraint, our foolish hope that civilization meant something beyond empty words and broken promises. We built hospitals on your worlds. We shared food during your famines. We taught your children and healed your sick and asked for nothing but peace in return. She leaned forward, and something ancient looked out through her eyes. You gave us New Eden as thanks. 4 million graves as payment for 3 centuries of kindness. Her voice dropped barely above a whisper, but somehow it echoed across every speaker on the diplomatic vessel. We were warriors once. The most effective killers our violent little planet ever produced. We perfected the art of destruction against each other for 10,000 years before we ever reached the stars. We chose peace because we knew what we were capable of. We buried the monsters we used to be because we hoped the universe would reward compassion. She straightened, and the military officers behind her stood at attention. The universe taught us differently. So hear me now, every species listening across every star. We stopped being warriors once. We chose peace. We buried our true nature under 300 years of civilization. The lights in her war room seemed to dim, or perhaps the galaxy simply grew darker. Now we stop being civilized. Now we dig up what we buried. And you will remember why our ancestors conquered their own world 100 times over before they ever looked to the sky. The transmission ended. The Concord delegation returned to their masters with a simple message. Humanity was done talking. Something was coming. Something that had been sleeping for 300 years. Across the galaxy. Species who had laughed at humanity suddenly stopped laughing. Those who had pitied them suddenly felt something else. Those who had dismissed them as harmless prey suddenly realized they had never truly understood what lurked beneath humanity's gentle smile in the depths of the Sol system. The forges burned brighter, and aboard the Velthary flagship, Admiral Vrexus received his first report of the human military buildup. He read it 3 times, unable to believe the numbers. Then he sent an urgent message to his high command. They are not building defenses, he wrote. They are building an invasion fleet. Suggest immediate preemptive strike before they can. He never finished the message. The first human warship crossed the Sol border the next morning. It was the size of a small moon, and it was not alone. The galaxy had seen warships before. Every spacefaring species built them. From the smallest patrol craft to the massive dreadnoughts that the Velthary used to crush their enemies. Military vessels were tools, machines designed for specific purposes. Built according to logical principles that had been refined over millions of years of galactic warfare. What emerged from the Sol? System was something else entirely. They came in a wave that blotted out the stars. Hundreds of vessels moving in perfect formation through the void. The smallest among them would have been classified as heavy cruisers by any other species. The largest defied classification altogether. They were not ships. They were weapons given form. Nightmares wrapped in armor plating and bristling with enough firepower to crack worlds. And they bore names that meant nothing to the galaxy but everything to humanity. The first ship to cross the border was called the Genghis, named for a man who had conquered half of Earth with nothing but horses and iron will. Behind it came the Attila, the Caesar, the Alexander, ships named for human warlords whose empires had drowned the world in blood. Deeper in the formation flew vessels with darker names still. The Hiroshima, the Stalingrad, the Verdun. Names of places where humanity had proven just how creatively they could destroy each other. At the heart of this armada flew the flagship. It was so massive that it bent light around its hull, a mobile fortress that could have housed 1 million soldiers within its depths. Its name was painted across its bow in letters visible from orbit. The Reckoning. Admiral Milky Tanaka stood on the bridge of this monster and watched the stars stream past. She was a small woman with gray-streaked hair and calm eyes that had seen decades of peacetime service. Like every other human military officer, she had spent her career conducting training exercises and attending diplomatic functions. The idea of actual combat had seemed like ancient history, something her distant ancestors had done before humanity learned better. Now she commanded the largest war fleet ever assembled by any species in galactic history. The ships themselves were not new. They had been built 3 centuries ago, during humanity's last great war against itself. When peace came and humanity chose to put violence behind them, these vessels were not destroyed. They were hidden, buried in asteroid fields and beneath planetary surfaces, sealed in vaults deep under Mars and within hollowed moons around Saturn, preserved in perfect condition by automated systems that had waited patiently for a day no one wanted to imagine. Now that day had come, Admiral Tanaka addressed her fleet as they entered the space between stars, heading toward Velthri territory. 300 years ago, our ancestors put down their weapons and swore to never raise them again. They hid these ships because they could not bear to destroy them. Some part of them knew that the universe might one day remind us of what we truly are. Her voice carried across thousands of vessels, reaching millions of ears. The Velthri believe they know war. They have conquered 17 species. They have burned worlds and enslaved populations and called themselves masters of destruction. She paused, and a ghost of a smile crossed her face. They have never fought humans. Our ancestors perfected the art of war against each other for 10,000 years. We killed millions in single battles. We split atoms and burned cities to shadow and nearly erased ourselves from existence. We learned every lesson that violence could teach. Her hands gripped the railing before her command station. Today we share those lessons with the Velthri. No mercy, no negotiation. No stopping until they understand exactly what they woke up when they touched our children. The fleet accelerated toward Velthri space. The first engagement came at the Velthri border, a defensive fleet of 30 warships, each one a veteran of campaigns that had crushed entire civilizations, moved to intercept the human armada. They were confident. 30 ships against several hundred was bad odds. But they only needed to delay the humans long enough for reinforcements to arrive. Besides, these were humans. Soft creatures who had never fired a shot in anger. How dangerous could they possibly be? The battle lasted 11 minutes. Human weapons were not like anything the Velthri had encountered. They did not fire energy beams or launch missiles in predictable patterns. They unleashed weapons that their ancestors had designed to end wars in hours instead of years. Kinetic rounds accelerated to significant fractions of light speed. Warheads that created temporary tears in the fabric of space. Electronic attacks that turned the Velthri ship's own systems against them. But the weapons were not the true surprise. The true surprise was how humans fought. There were no formations, no predictable patterns. Each human ship seemed to operate independently, yet they moved together like a single organism with 1,000 bodies. They adapted in real time, changing tactics between one heartbeat and the next. When the Velthri tried one defense, humans simply invented a new attack. When they attempted to retreat, humans were already there, cutting off their escape routes. 10,000 years of killing each other had taught humanity something precious. War was not about following rules. War was about winning by any means necessary. With any tool available, using every scrap of creativity and ruthlessness that the human mind could muster, the Velthri had never faced anything like it. Not a single Velthri ship survived the engagement. Not a single human ship was seriously damaged. Admiral Vrexus received news of the battle aboard his flagship, deep in Velthri territory. He read the report 3 times, certain there must be some mistake. An entire border fleet wiped out in 11 minutes by humans. The same species that had spent 3 centuries bowing and smiling and negotiating. He immediately called for reinforcements. The entire Velthri military was mobilizing now, pulling ships from conquered worlds and distant outposts. This was no longer a simple, punitive campaign against weak prey. This was war. But as more reports came in over the following days, Vrexus began to understand something that filled his cold insectoid blood with an unfamiliar sensation. Fear. The humans were not stopping. They pushed deeper into fell through space with terrifying speed, their fleet growing rather than shrinking as more vessels arrived from Sol. They bypassed heavily defended military installations, heading straight for softer targets. Colony worlds. Industrial centers. The supply lines that kept the HFY war machine running, and everywhere they went. They left the same message written in the wreckage of HFY defenses. Remember, New Eden. The galaxy watched in stunned silence. Species that had dismissed humanity as harmless prey now stared at their screens in disbelief. The gentle traders who built hospitals were gone. The kind diplomats who always chose peace had vanished. In their place was something ancient and terrible, something that had been sleeping beneath humanity's civilized surface for 300 years. The Galactic Concord called emergency sessions. They debated intervention, demanded ceasefires, threatened sanctions. They sent official warnings to Earth, reminding humanity of their treaty obligations. Chancellor Okonkwo's response was brief. File your grievances with the HFY? They started this. We will finish it. Any species that interferes will be treated as their ally. Debates continued, but no one moved to stop the human advance. Not because they did not want to, because they were afraid to, for the first time in 300 years. The galaxy was learning what humanity had tried so hard to forget. They were not the peaceful traders the universe had come to know. That was a mask worn by choice, because they hoped the stars would be kinder than their own history. Beneath that mask was something forged in 10,000 years of blood and fire. A species that had turned war into art form, that had invented weapons capable of destroying worlds before they ever left their home planet. The HFY had poked this sleeping monster and called it weak. Now it was awake, and it was hungry, deep in HFY. Space. Admiral Tanaka reviewed the latest intelligence reports and plotted the next phase of her campaign. The HFY military was impressive by galactic standards, but she had already identified a dozen weaknesses in their tactics. Their command structure was too rigid. Their fleet movements were too predictable. They fought according to rules that had worked against species who also followed rules. Humans had never been good at following rules. She marked her next target on the strategic display. A major HFY supply hub, defended by their largest remaining fleet. Taking it would cripple their ability to reinforce their homeworld. How long until we reach optimal engagement range? She asked her tactical officer. 14 hours, Admiral. She nodded. Tell the fleet to rest. When we arrive, I want everyone sharp. The HFY are about to learn what happens when you make humanity remember what it is. The reckoning accelerated toward its destination, and the stars themselves seemed to tremble. The HFY had conquered 17 species. Each conquest had followed the same pattern. Overwhelming force applied without mercy, crushing resistance in a matter of weeks. Then centuries of absolute rule enforced by garrisons and terror. They had perfected this process over thousands of years. It always worked. Against humanity. Nothing worked. The first ground engagement happened on Velth Prime 7, a major industrial colony that produced weapons for the HFY military. Admiral Tanaka's fleet had reduced its orbital defenses to scattered debris. And now, human. Transport ships descended through the atmosphere carrying the first wave of ground forces. The HFY commanders on the surface were confused. Standard galactic doctrine called for orbital bombardment first, softening ground targets until they could be taken with minimal casualties. But the humans were landing troops, while the colony's defenses remained largely intact. They were inviting a ground war. The HFY accepted the invitation eagerly. Ground combat was their specialty. Their warriors were larger, stronger, and covered in natural armor that could stop most projectile weapons. They had never lost a ground campaign in their entire history. Human soldiers emerged from their landing, craft wearing suits of armor that seemed to flow like liquid metal. The HFY opened fire with their standard infantry weapons. Confident in their superior numbers and firepower, the humans did not fall. Their armor adapted in real time, analyzing incoming fire and restructuring itself to provide better protection. Weapons that worked in the first minute became useless in the second. The HFY switched tactics. tempting to close for hand-to-hand combat where their superior strength would decide the outcome. The humans let them come. Then they showed the Velthari what 10,000 years of killing each other had taught about close quarters fighting. It was not a battle. It was a lesson. Human soldiers moved through Velthari formations like water through sand. They did not fight in formations or follow predictable patterns. Each human was an independent combat unit, making decisions in fractions of seconds. Adapting to changing circumstances with terrifying speed, they used every tool available. From advanced weapons to improvised explosives to their own armored fists. But the weapons were not what broke the Velthari. It was the creativity. One human squad cut off from reinforcements turned a food processing facility into a trap that killed an entire Velthari company. Another group of soldiers, running low on ammunition, hacked into the colony's automated systems and turned mining equipment into weapons. A single human sniper, isolated in a ruined building, held off 100 Velthari warriors for 6 hours using nothing but rubble and determination. The Velthari had never faced anything like this. Their previous conquests involved species who fought in orderly patterns, who could be predicted and countered. Humans refused to be predictable. Every time the Velthari thought they understood human tactics, the humans simply invented new ones. Velth Prime 7 fell in 3 days, across the galaxy. Species watched the ground combat footage in shocked silence. The gentle humans who built hospitals were gone. These soldiers moved with practiced ease through environments of blood and fire. Their movements almost casual as they dismantled one of the most feared ground forces in known space. They did not fight like any species the galaxy had ever encountered. They fought like apex predators who had finally stopped pretending to be herbivores. But the ground forces were not the most terrifying part, as human military formations advanced deeper into Velthari territory. Something unexpected began happening on worlds the humans had already captured. Resistance movements appeared overnight. Sabotage struck Velthari supply lines with surgical precision. Commanders were assassinated in secure facilities. Communication networks went dark at critical moments. At first, the Velthari assumed these were human special forces, elite units trained for behind-the-lines operations. They were wrong. They were civilians. Human. Civilians who had been living peacefully on Velthari-occupied worlds for decades. Farmers, teachers, engineers, merchants, people who had never touched a weapon in their lives. Who had integrated into galactic society as the gentle traders everyone expected humans to be, until new. Eden burned. Now they remembered who they were. They remembered the stories their grandparents had told about Earth's history. About guerrilla fighters and underground resistance movements and ordinary people, who became warriors when their families were threatened. They did not need military training. They had something better. 10,000 years of ancestral memory encoded in their very DNA, teaching them that when the tribe was threatened, every member of the tribe became a weapon. They made their own explosives from cleaning supplies. They turned farming equipment into traps. They passed information through codes hidden in ordinary conversations. They struck without warning and vanished before retaliation could come. They were everywhere and nowhere. An invisible army with no uniforms and no chain of command and no mercy. The Velthari High Command had no response to this. Their entire military doctrine was built around fighting other militaries. They had conquered species by destroying their armies and occupying their worlds. But humans did not work that way. Kill their soldiers and their civilians picked up weapons. Occupy their worlds, and the occupation force never slept safely again. For the first time, Velthari commanders began using a word they had never needed before. Retreat. The Galactic Concord called emergency session after emergency session, demanding that humanity stop its campaign of destruction. They threatened trade sanctions. They promised diplomatic isolation. They warned of consequences that would take generations to undo. Chancellor Okonkwo appeared before their assembly one final time. Her image projected across the Great Hall, where representatives of 47 species sat in judgment. "You want us to stop," she said, her voice flat. "You want us to negotiate? To be reasonable? To act civilized?" She held up an image, a simple photograph. It showed a human school on New Eden before the massacre. Children sat at their desks, smiling at the camera, their whole lives ahead of them. This is what civilized got us. This is what reasonable achieved. These children are ash now, because we trusted your treaties and your laws, and your promises of protection. She lowered the image, and her eyes swept across the assembled representatives. Where were you when they were burning? Where were your demands for restraint when Velthari soldiers were hunting our families through the streets? You said nothing. You did nothing. You wrote concerned messages, and held meetings and pretended that process would somehow bring our dead back to life. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Now you want us to stop. Now you want to talk about proportional response and galactic stability? She shook her head slowly. No, you had your chance to stand with us. You chose silence. Now you will sit in silence while we handle this our way. Any species that interferes will learn the same lesson the Velthari are learning. A Concord representative stood, his voice trembling with either fear or anger. You cannot threaten the entire galaxy. You are one species among 47. We could unite against you. You could try? Chancellor Okonkwo interrupted, her smile without warmth. But you will not. Do you know why? Because right now, every species in this room is calculating the same thing. If humanity can do this to the Velthari, a species that has conquered 17 worlds, what could they do to us? The silence that followed was absolute. We were peaceful because we chose to be peaceful. We traded instead of conquered because we believed that was the better path. We smiled at your insults and negotiated through your provocations because we hoped the universe would reward kindness with kindness. She turned to leave, then paused. The universe taught us differently. So now we are teaching the same lesson to the Velthari. When we are finished, perhaps the universe will have learned something as well. She walked out of the assembly hall, and not a single representative tried to stop her. In the void between stars, the human armada continued its advance. Velthari worlds fell one after another, their garrisons swept aside like leaves before a hurricane. The High Command pulled forces from every corner of their empire. Building a final defensive line around their homeworld, they had calculated the numbers carefully. They still had more ships than the humans. They still had stronger defenses and better positions. If they could stop the human advance here, they could negotiate from a position of strength. They still did not. Understand, Admiral Tanaka reviewed their defensive positions and smiled. The Velthari were fighting like a species that expected war to have rules. They would learn soon enough. Humanity had written the rules of war, and humanity had never been good at following them. The final battle was approaching. The Velthari homeworld hung in space like a dark jewel, orbited by 3 moons that had been converted into military fortresses over centuries of conquest. The largest fleet ever assembled by the Dominion surrounded it in layers of defensive formations. Thousands of warships bristling with weapons that had crushed 17 species into submission. Admiral Vrexus stood on the bridge of the Eternal Hunger, watching the human armada approach. 200 days had passed since New Eden burned. 200 days of defeats that should have been impossible. 200 days of watching everything his species had built crumble before creatures they had dismissed as prey. He had requested surrender terms 6 times. Each request had been denied with the same message. Remember New Eden? Now the humans were here, at the heart of Velthari space, ready to end what the Velthari had started. Vrexus looked at the strength of his defensive fleet and felt something he had never experienced before: doubt. The battle began at dawn. Local time, human ships moved through the Velthari defensive layers like predators through a herd, striking weak points that should have been invisible, exploiting gaps that opened for fractions of seconds. The Velthari fought with the desperation of a species facing extinction, throwing everything they had at the invaders. It was not enough, Admiral Tanaka commanded from the Bridge of the Reckoning, her voice calm as she directed the systematic destruction of Velthari defenses. She had studied their tactics for months. She knew how they thought, how they moved, how they reacted to pressure. More importantly, she knew something they had never learned: how to adapt, The battle lasted 18 hours. By its end, the great Velthri fleet was scattered wreckage drifting through the void. The fortress moons were silent tombs, and human landing craft descended through the atmosphere of the Velthri homeworld like metal. Rain, there was no resistance. Left to stop them, human soldiers moved through the streets of the Velthri capital with careful precision. They were not there to destroy. They were there to end this war on humanity's terms. Military installations were seized. Government buildings were secured. Velthri leaders who had ordered the massacre of New Eden were captured and held for trial, but they were not harmed. Not yet. The galaxy watched in confusion. After months of brutal warfare, after destroying one of the most powerful military forces in known space, humanity suddenly stopped. They held the Velthri homeworld in an iron grip, but they did not burn it to ash, as the Velthri had burned New Eden. Why? Chancellor Amara Okonkwo arrived on the Velthri homeworld 3 days after its fall. She walked through the ruins of the capital, past human soldiers standing guard and Velthri civilians watching with compound eyes filled with terror. She came alone, without guards, without weapons. Just an old woman with tired eyes and a weight on her shoulders that was visible in every step. She stood in what had been the Velthri Grand Assembly, where the High Command had given the order to massacre New Eden. Now, it was a courtroom, filled with recording equipment that would broadcast to every world in the galaxy. Admiral Vrexus was brought before her in chains. Beside him stood every member of the High Command. Every officer who had participated in the planning of the massacre, every pilot who had dropped bombs on human children. There were hundreds of them. The galaxy held its breath. 200 days ago, Chancellor Okonkwo began, her voice echoing through the silent chamber. You gave an order. You decided that 4.2 million human beings, including hundreds of thousands of children, should die. Not because they threatened you, not because they had harmed you, but because you wanted to send a message. You wanted to show the galaxy that humanity was prey. She paused, letting her words settle. The message was received. You taught us something we had forgotten, something we hoped we would never need to remember. You reminded us of what we are when our children are threatened. Admiral Vrexus tried to speak, to offer some justification, some excuse. Chancellor Okonkwo raised her hand and he fell silent. I could destroy your species. Our weapons could burn your worlds to bare rock. Our soldiers could hunt your people through the ruins the way your soldiers hunted ours. We have the power to end your civilization so completely that 1,000 years from now, no one would remember your species ever existed. The Velthri in the chamber trembled. This was what they expected. This was what they would have done, but we are not you. Chancellor Okonkwo's voice softened, and somehow that was more terrifying than anger. We were never you. That is what you failed to understand. We chose peace not because we were weak, but because we knew what we were capable of when we chose war. We buried our violent nature because we hoped, truly hoped, that the universe would reward kindness with kindness. She shook her head slowly. You taught us that was foolish, but you also taught us something else. If we become you, if we respond to massacre with extinction, then everything we believed about ourselves was a lie, and we cannot accept that. She straightened, and her voice became iron. So instead of extinction, you will receive justice. Every individual who participated in the planning or execution of the New Eden massacre will face trial. The evidence will be presented. Sentences will be carried out. Your military will be dismantled. Your ability to threaten other species will be removed permanently. Your government will be restructured to ensure this can never happen again. She looked directly at Admiral Vrexus. You will live. Your species will survive. But you will never forget what happened here, and neither will the galaxy. The trials lasted for months. The evidence was overwhelming. Every order, every communication, every piece of planning that had led to New Eden's destruction was presented before a galactic audience. The galaxy watched Velthri leaders try to justify the murder of children, and the galaxy judged them. Sentences were carried out according to human law, adapted for galactic circumstances. There was no torture. no prolonged suffering. But there was no mercy either. Those responsible for New Eden died knowing exactly why they were dying. When it was over, Chancellor Okonkwo addressed the galaxy one final time. She stood in the ashes of the Velthri capital, exhausted and old, carrying the weight of everything humanity had done and everything they had chosen not to do. 3 centuries ago, we came to the stars with open hands. We believed that kindness was strength. We still believe that. But we also learned something in the past 200 days. Kindness without the ability to defend it is just surrender by another name. She looked at the camera and threw it at every species in the galactic concord. We will return to our peaceful ways. We will rebuild. We will trade and heal and teach just as we did before. But we will never again forget what lies beneath our civilized surface. And neither should you. She paused, and a hint of the old warmth returned to her eyes. We genuinely want peace. We prefer negotiation to violence. We would rather build hospitals than warships. But touch our children again, threaten our people again, and you will see what you saw here. Not because we enjoy it, not because we want it, but because we will protect our own with everything we have, no matter the cost. She turned and walked away. The broadcast ended. Humanity rebuilt New Eden, not as a colony, but as a memorial. A garden world where no weapons would ever be permitted, where the names of 4.2 million souls were carved into mountains visible from orbit. Human ships visited regularly, laying flowers on mass graves that had been transformed into fields of eternal spring. The Galactic Concord quietly amended its charter. A new law was added, unspoken but understood by every species. Do not provoke humanity. In the centuries that followed, humans returned to their peaceful ways. They traded with species across the galaxy. They built hospitals on former enemy worlds. They shared food during famines and medicine during plagues. They smiled at insults and negotiated through provocations, always choosing the diplomatic path first. But now, when they smiled, the galaxy noticed something it had missed before: their teeth, and in classified files across 1,000 civilizations, passed from one generation to the next. A simple warning was recorded for future leaders to read and remember. Humans are the friendliest species in the galaxy. They genuinely want peace. They will help you when you are in need and forgive you when you make mistakes. They prefer talking to fighting and building to destroying. They are kind, generous, and forgiving. The file would pause here, letting the reader absorb this information, almost. Then the final line, underlined and marked with the highest priority classification. Never make them stop being civilized. You will not survive the lesson. The stars continued their eternal dance through the void. Humanity continued its peaceful journey among them, building and healing and hoping as they always had. But now the galaxy knew the truth. The kindness was real. The peace was genuine. The hope was sincere. And beneath it all, sleeping but never dead, was something that had conquered a world 100 times before it. Ever reached for the stars. The galaxy had learned its lesson. It would never forget.